Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri. Now, this is a show called Insight, and we discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide some insight into the present, and sometimes some broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that try to put politics into a broader general setting. This book is a combination of politics, history, and Supreme Court case. It's written by Adam Winkler, who is a law professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. And the title of his book is called Gunfight: The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Tania Contreras. To Tania's right is Drew Strohecker. And to Drew's right is Moses Milan. So I wanted to read an opening quote from the book and then jump into a discussion about it. The author writes, "The more guns, less crime philosophy has not worked to protect Americans very well so far. The United States has the highest rate of gun ownership of any developed country and the highest rate of gun violence. Armed guards in every school may not help. Columbine High School had an armed guard who engaged in a shootout with the two school shooters, but he was quickly overpowered. Several of the mass shootings in 2012 took place in states with permissive concealed carry laws. None of them, however, were stopped by people with guns. States with permissive concealed carry laws generally don't require extensive training. An hour or two on the gun range shooting at targets isn't adequate training to engage in a high-stress shootout in a public place. Perhaps the mistake begins with the goal of preventing mass killings. Such shootings cannot be prevented. Gun control resources would be better spent in trying to reduce the daily routine death toll from guns. Every day in America, nearly 40 people die as a result of the criminal misuse of guns. Requiring universal background checks would work with gun purchases. Anyone can sell a gun without verifying that the purchaser is legally allowed to buy it. That makes no sense if we are committed to making it as difficult as possible for criminals and the mentally ill to obtain guns.
So one of the first things that I wanted to talk about in the book is something that the author himself repeats time and time again, and it's that gun control and gun rights are not as mutually exclusive as most people say. People who are pro-gun typically see any form of gun control policy as being very bad because they feel like any policy that might restrict some aspects of their rights to own guns will essentially lead to complete removal of guns from all homes. And on the opposite end, you have people who are pro-gun control who believe that any person with a gun could be rather dangerous and that we should instead push to absolute gun control in order to reduce crime and violence. But one of the things that the author points out is that it's very dangerous to follow either of these two extremes, and that the first thing that we have to realize is that gun control and gun rights are not mutually exclusive.
The book also does a great job in illustrating the history of the gun control and the pro-gun debate in general. It talks a lot about the NRA and the origins of that and how the gun argument really is kind of a modern entity. It didn't start to happen until the 1970s when the NRA became the political giant that it is today, lobbying for more gun rights and basically trying to chop down any sort of gun control law that goes through.
Yeah, I think one of the best points the author make is the agenda is set by the extremists on both sides. Mm-hmm. So what results from that is we don't get an actual good plan put forward to actually stop gun violence. Like he touched on, the mass majority of deaths don't come from mass shootings, they come from regular everyday shootings, things that could be stopped with institutionalizing the mentally ill, cracking down on urban crime. These are plans that are a little beyond the idea of more guns or less guns, but these are the things that will actually stop gun violence.
Yeah, I think what happens is when you have a mass shooting, you sort of react to it, and unfortunately, you're reacting to it rather than saying, look, we're not, and you can't expect a politician to say, look, we're not going to be able to stop that, because then suddenly you sound insensitive. But unfortunately, then, instead of saying something like, okay, this was a mass shooting, what can we do about trying to reduce gun violence in some way, is a problem of just how you're going to be perceived on television. And I guess one of the problems I've always had is to use terms like gun control. Just saying the term and then sounds as though it's so absolute, as though you're supposed to come down on one side or the other. And I know I frequently, in both courses and when I've written about this, have written about, it's called degrees of gun regulation, which is more difficult to grasp, but that in reality, this is where you actually find people falling. And over the years, when I have conversations with people that have been gun dealers, that do a great deal of shooting, that collect guns, etc., they don't talk in nutty language. And it's that nutty absolutism that you end up having a problem with, where people either don't understand enough about guns, and so they say outrageously silly things about elimination of them, or they talk in absolute language about the Second Amendment but have absolutely no knowledge of anything in the Constitution. I read a quote from a congressman somewhere where some constituent was berating him about support the Second Amendment, support the Second Amendment. And he asked the guy, okay, what's the First Amendment? And he says, there is none. Which is sort of a silly thing to say.
And I think it's actually, he brings it up within the book, that it's a dichotomous issue that doesn't exist exclusively just in the gun debate. When you look at most of the controversial topics like gay marriage, like abortion, there's always this mentality that you either have to be on this side or this side, and there's no really gray area. And so when we eliminate that gray area, that eliminates any possibility to have any real compromise. And he talks about how most of the people, because the Second Amendment is so vague and is so broad, have this huge disagreement about whether the Second Amendment actually means that we have individual rights to own guns, or whether it's simply stating that the state has a right to regulate a militia. And he addresses this later on in the book as well.
The militia theory argument that it makes comes from a 1939 Supreme Court case that talks about how it basically, the Supreme Court never said that only the militias are allowed to be the ones to have guns, but because of that case where they said, they worded it in just a way that they included the word militia in having guns, that people take that theory as the Supreme Court stance up until 2008, when in the Heller versus the District of Columbia case that touches on how they basically affirmed that individual citizens were allowed to have firearms. So.
Well, I think the main point here is really that the politicians have failed the people on this issue. We see people on both sides of the aisle, politicians who don't want to have a solution. They'd rather pander to the loudest minority on either side of their party. We see things like assault weapons bans that the author, Adam Winkler, is pretty clear he doesn't think will work. And he says the data is pretty well clear that that's not going to work. And yet that issue alone is what's running the dialogue and has run the dialogue for the past couple of years. And then what we see from the pro-gun side isn't anything better. We see calls to arm every teacher in America, and that this somehow is going to stop mass shootings and stop shootings in general. And Winkler's pretty clear that this type of extremism and the politicians that empower this extremism isn't going to solve the issue.
Yeah, the book is weaving through the whole book, because basically what he's trying to do is to lay the foundation for this Supreme Court case in 2008 called Heller versus District of Columbia, which says you have the individual right of gun ownership. But just saying that and then actually reading some of the words former Justice or the late Justice Scalia, and so as a result, you're sitting down there and realizing how you take a look at definitions of this. Even in the court case opinion, it isn't quite as absolute as people would like to believe, but he was trying to show through the book that there's this belief that is there the militia theory, which somehow allows government regulation, usually at the state level, or is there something called the individual right of gun ownership, which somehow limits the right of state regulation? Well, what he's showing is throughout the book, because the militia theory dominated for so long, you had gun rights groups pushing for and getting state constitutional changes. And within your Bill of Rights, within your state constitutions, you emphasize the right of individual gun ownership. And so then he's questioning, well, as a result, the Supreme Court case, okay, you get there, it's a nice victory, but you already had this within states because of so many states stating very clearly you have the right of individual gun ownership.
And it's so interesting that the entire case was originally meant to just be in addressing the Washington, D.C. law. Originally, it was actually because I believe it was a woman was afraid that she might be in danger because she would constantly call in people who were drug dealing, and she feared for her own life. And a lot of people who were living in D.C. who wanted a gun for personal safety, not for recreational purposes, but for personal safety, felt like the law was preventing them from being safe because this woman was honestly didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she should get a gun and protect herself, or if she should just not get a gun and potentially put herself in danger. And so essentially what was interesting about this case is the fact that it wasn't originally intended to be a national issue, and yet it somehow ended up being a national issue, and surprisingly ended up in the NRA's favor. He mentions time and time again that the NRA actually wanted to stop this debate from occurring, and I think it's very ironic that it actually is now like the NRA's priority is, individual ownership of guns, when in reality they never wanted that.
The National Rifle Association hated the case, and
Exactly.
they kept trying to not have it come, and they tried to do everything they can to prevent it, because I think it's sort of important. They sort of emphasize there's conservative and there's libertarian, and as a result they saw the Supreme Court as conservative. So conservative would mean that you might be relying on precedent, and precedent would mean that you might rely on the 1939 Supreme Court case decision saying militia theory, whereas libertarian would imply that you're willing to overturn precedent. And so as a result, they took the opinion that the Supreme Court was conservative but not libertarian. Whereas the attorney arguing the case saw himself as libertarian, believing the Supreme Court would overturn precedent.
Certainly. Well, I think a big issue with the conservative versus libertarian viewpoint is that conservatives are more concerned with law and order, whereas libertarians are more concerned with personal liberty. So a conservative justice, particularly Sandra Day O'Connor, who was a Reagan appointee, but a very strict conservative on things like law and order, she might not look too favorably on a bill that is allowing people more personal freedom for firearms. So the NRA was very disturbed and concerned that she might vote the other way, and this would be a very strong legal rebuke to their idea of an individual right to own a firearm.
On the other side of the page, too, the libertarians saw the NRA's attack on their case as possibly feeling like the NRA would be threatened by the success of the case, even because the NRA makes so much money every year off of screaming that the government is coming to take your guns. And if the Second Amendment was affirmed by the Supreme Court, I think it's fair for them to assume that the NRA would be afraid that they would lose donation dollars because of that.
That was the argument that was actually made by Alan Gura, who was the one doing this case and eventually wins it. And so it's odd, it's not coming from liberal critics of the NRA, it's coming from Alan Gura seeing himself as a libertarian, and he's saying the NRA doesn't want the case because it's going to affect their fundraising drive, which was sort of an odd sort of way of looking at it. Well, it obviously hasn't, because they still managed to find ways of screaming that people are coming to take your guns. So, in one way, you win, or the National Rifle Association wins in getting the idea of individual gun ownership rights defined through a Supreme Court case, but it hasn't stopped them from still being paranoid that your guns are going to be taken away.
No, and I agree. I mean, sadly, a lot of the politics that we have today in terms of most controversial issues oftentimes really do rely on fear. Like, the government is going to take away your right to do what you want with your body, or the government's going to take away your property, and the government's going to do this. Or on the opposite end, you have the government is taking away your rights already as a minority, as a woman, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of it does play off of fears. But I just genuinely find it very ironic that the NRA just genuinely benefits from this court case above anything else. And they were so against it. And now it's like their primary motive for what they do now. So I guess the lesson here is maybe sometimes you kind of have to go with your opponent in order to get what you want.
He has a nice quote. He said, "Bad gun laws do start trends." And from that, he then went on the problems of defining semi-automatic, so that when you eventually passed the assault weapons ban, he said, well, if you think about it, a pistol can be defined of as semi-automatic. And so I think I would say his major emphasis is private gun ownership is what he was trying to say. Why can't you address that? Because that's what he puts at 40% of gun sales in America are private sales, and that nobody's making even an attempt to figure out who's buying these guns.
And that comes through a loophole in the law where it states that small gun sales, between individuals do not need to be licensed or background checked or regulated by the government, because it would be kind of crazy to go through all of the paperwork and red tape that it would take to make sure that the government could make sure, the FBI and everyone else could make sure that that is a legitimate sale. And because of the fact that they don't want to regulate, or don't have the resources rather to regulate that kind of a thing, it makes it very easy for people to get guns who wouldn't be able to otherwise, I guess.
The whole part of the book, and a lot of it, dealt with historical development, which I thought was done very well. It's interesting, he refers to the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, as a gun control group. That essentially what they were doing was taking guns away from newly freed former slaves. And so as a result, they come into existence, they don't want guns in the South, and so there they are taking guns away. But as a result, he then also goes through it in the Old West, let's say, the image, and that it was very normal to come into many Western towns and you had to turn in your guns before coming into town, as opposed to the image we have of the gunfight at OK Corral, and so you're under the impression that there's guns all over the place, so he's sort of saying then as a result we've had the development of the both together gun rights and gun regulation complementary, not necessarily at odds with each other.
And that's an issue that he brings up because he's trying to go against the misconception that gun control is sort of a new 20th century phenomenon, because it's been there since the creation of the Second Amendment, and he acknowledges that himself, that even way back when the Founding Fathers first created the Second Amendment, saying that you could have a militia, they still regulated who could have a gun. Like if you were a woman, you weren't allowed to have a gun. If you were a minority, if you didn't own land, if you, for whatever reason, were deemed not, worthy of owning a gun, you didn't own a gun. And oftentimes a lot of those guns were also registered, and they kept track of who had what at what place in certain areas. And so gun control has always existed to a certain degree. And so it's just kind of crazy that people think that it's sort of a more modern concept.
And people also perceive it as more of a partisan concept. We see the conservative right and the liberal left, when in reality, up until the 70s, gun control was never a right or left issue. It was always a local issue, it was a state issue. But when we saw things like the Reagan assassination, John F. Kennedy.
Well attempted.
Oh, right. What we saw with that was a real poisoning of the dialogue along both sides. We saw calls to end all private handgun ownership, and then that's when the NRA really ramped up its efforts. Most people don't understand the NRA was a shooting club before it was anything else. And when the 80s and the 70s and the 60s really poisoned the dialogue with guns, that spurred the NRA to become the political powerhouse it is now, more or less just sticking up for anything against any gun control, even gun regulations that would actually help the issue.
What I thought was interesting about what he pointed out about the NRA is the Second Amendment never affected them or they even cared about it until the 1970s. And it only somewhere in the 70s you're making the transition that suddenly they're talking about the importance of the Second Amendment, but they didn't give a hoot about it prior to that. And suddenly it emerges. And so as a result, he's sort of pointing that from that point of view, from their side, let's say from a conservative point of view, here's your intransient organization that won't sort of discuss, and how are you going to find this middle ground? Because he's got his quote, he says, in the skewed worldview of gun rights hardliners, guns don't kill people, gun control does. And it was sort of just an interesting little quote, because again, he feels there is some way to find some understandable middle ground, but that I don't know if he believes it's really going to happen.
Part of that problem comes from how the legislation has happened in the past few years. I mean, there's been gun regulation laws that go through, but they're definitely not meaningful laws. They're not going to really affect how the guns are applied to people in the real world, because they're just weak laws. And they're weak laws because of these huge lobbying groups like the NRA, where if a gun law starts to go through, the NRA is going to make sure that it's not well enough funded to work properly or do its job at all. And in that way, they kind of prove their own point as to where gun laws won't work. But it's because of this, backlash from the extreme sides on either end, where the people who are putting through the gun legislation, because it usually doesn't work, they're just hungry to get any kind of legislation through that they can.
Yeah, he points that out as sort of an irony, he says. There's this irony that anytime you propose any type of gun regulation, the NRA will make sure that it gets very watered down, and then they'll turn around and say, see, the law didn't work, without anybody saying, well, wait a minute, you did your best to water it down to make sure it wouldn't work.
Yep.
And so he points that out as something that sort of weaves itself through the book.
Right. I think part of the problem with that is a lot of the gun control legislation isn't being put forward to solve the problem. It's being put forward to placate a base. Back to the assault weapons ban. I think less than 2% of gun deaths are going to come from an assault weapon. Yet this, once again, dominates the debate. And you're right in saying that these laws aren't effective in solving gun violence, but they are effective in ginning up the pro-gun lobbying groups. It's such a good fundraiser when you have an assault weapons ban being voted on. People give all sorts of money, all sorts of support. They vote in block pattern if they feel that their gun rights are being under attack. When if you put forward more reasonable gun legislation like universal background checks, closing some of the loopholes, these things would get more broad support, as opposed to an assault weapons ban, which would not get support and doesn't solve the problem.
One of the things he talked about in the book was he was talking about two books that were written. One was called Armed America, and so a historian went through various colonial sites, basically sort of what was passed down from one family after they died to the next, so you'd be going through wills. And then the other book was called More Guns, Less Crime, written by a man named John Lott. And so he was trying to show how both of these books, one supporting the notion of guns weren't that big in America, and the other one sort of supporting the position of, no, you need your concealed weapon because it's going to reduce crime, were badly written. And that they weren't just badly written, they were written, both books were written with sort of falsification of data. And both authors can't substantiate what they wrote. And it was the same researcher who looked at both books and said, wait a minute, there's a problem with both books. And so this notion of here, people may still cite these books as examples, and yet here they are being both attacked as sort of lacking credibility.
And I believe the issue with the first one was actually that the guy who was conducting the research had extended research, and everybody was so amazed by it, because the assertion was that people back in the 18th century, in the 1800s and the 1700s didn't own quite as many guns as we thought that they did. And I remember that the author talked about how there were protesters at his speech who said, well, I have 4 guns that my father gave me, but he never wrote them in a will or any form of document. So how can you say for sure, looking at past documents, that you can conclude that guns were not passed from generations to generations? Just because they weren't recorded doesn't mean that they weren't there. And the guy who went after the author of Armed America found that he actually falsified a lot of his information because he had a lot of records that were misidentified,
Right.
where they would actually be guns written into the will and he would just overlook them. Or he had records that were copies of each other. He said that a lot of his records were actually on old yellow notepads that mysteriously got destroyed in a flood. You know, it was very sketchy, to say the least.
Same thing with the More Guns, Less
Yeah.
Crime book, because then you realize that the surveys he was citing weren't really surveys. He was sort of finding something that was very tenuous and then applying it, and then he pointed to a researcher, and the researcher said he was great, he was wonderful, he did meticulous research, and then you checked and found out that the woman whose name was Mary Rouse was actually the author, John Lott. He invented somebody. And so we only have a few minutes left, so let's go through what you think of this book, and do you recommend the audience read it or not?
I think the book overall has a pretty non-biased view on gun control. It does technically look at both sides for most of it. So I think if you're trying to look for something that's maybe not too left or too right of a book to form an opinion on gun rights, I think, or gun issues, I think this would be a good book to read. Although I will say I did find it a little bit repetitive. He said the same point over and over and over again, that we couldn't find a middle ground. So I found it to be a little bit repetitive in the beginning, but overall it was pretty good.
I would agree that it's a great book if you're looking for like a historical narrative. It gives a really great story to the background of how a lot of things came to be how they are today, how the NRA became to what it is today, how gun legislation and the gridlock that has occurred became. And I would definitely recommend the book to anyone who likes that kind of a narrative and what they read.
Absolutely. Reading this book, it's obvious to see Winkler, he's not out to please anyone. He's out to do some research and to find the truth. I think this book is in 2 parts. It's in the historical part and the legal part. The historical part might be something you want to read down the line when you have a better understanding of the ins and outs of the regulation. But for the first third of the book, which focused on the legal issues, I think that'd be a great read for someone who's just learning about the gun issue.
Yeah, I think it's a very good book, readable, and so what you do is, what's often missing when they talk about court cases on television is they don't bother to provide any of the background. Basically, they'll say, mention something, and then suddenly you're to the case, and you realize, in this case, you're seeing how a court case developed over a period of years and eventually got there, and how you're looking at all these various forces that are pushing it in different directions. Certainly the irony of the National Rifle Association opposing the case, that ends up becoming a hallmark of theirs, that suddenly recognizing you have the right of individual gun ownership, which started to come up in the second George Bush administration, son, not the father, where his Attorney General, John Ashcroft, announces that they recognize the right of individual gun ownership prior to any court case. So as a result, you were seeing a very good development, and then he has a good way of presenting it. It's a very readable book, and so I think people can get something out of it. And so, yeah, it's going to frustrate people that might think of themselves in extreme versions. But for middle America that wants some sort of way of understanding something, I'd recommend the book. So thank you for joining us today.